Hi, I'm Thomas Mariadason, and I'm the Interim Executive Director at Center for Political Education, and this is CPE Study Hall. Through CPE Study Hall, Center for Political Education meets with authors of materials we think can make our struggles more powerful to talk about how these materials can be put to use by organizers and activists. I'm here with Dan Berger and Emily Hobson. Dan is an Associate Professor of Comparative Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington, Bethel, and the author of Captive Nation, Black Prison Organizing in the Civil Rights Era from the University of North Carolina Press, among many other titles. Emily is an Associate Professor of History and Gender, Race, and Identity at the University of Nevada, Reno, and the author of Lavender and Red, Liberation and Solidarity in the Gay and Lesbian Left, published by University of California Press. Dan and Emily are here to talk about their most recent volume, Remaking Radicalism, an anthology of documents from multiple radical movements in the United States. Dan and Emily have tracked the history of popular struggles during a time that spans the presidencies of Richard Nixon and George W. Bush, bringing readers to political upheavals that shaped the end of the century and that continue to define the present. The book includes 164 written documents, 20 images, and 32 short essays that reflect a wide mix of organizations, campaigns, tactics, and visions. Grouped into thematic sections that reflect multiple approaches to different sites of struggle and to struggle on different scales, the book sources reflect the modes of thinking and organizing among left-wing US social movements from 1973 to 2001. Dan and Emily, welcome to CPE Study Hall. Emily, let me start with you. Why 1973 to 2001? What was so compelling to you and Dan about that span of time for left-wing US social movements?
Yeah, sure. So thank you, first of all, so much for having us. It's really wonderful to be in conversation. And, CPE is precisely the kind of audience that we hope the book could be useful to. So we're excited to be in conversation. So 1973 to 2001 we approached it as a really useful span of time to think about the recent past and to think about the post 1960s era, right? So when people talk about movements of the long 1960s, they often talk about them as kind of concluding in 1973 or 1975, with both of those years being really significant to the end of US war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. 1973 specifically is withdrawal of troops, US troops from Vietnam, and also, a year of very profound recession, onset of recession in the US, and a marked trend towards deindustrialization. And so kind of an important moment for some of the economic shifts that we think about as really entrenching neoliberalism. And then, of course, 2001 is the year of September 11th attacks. And we wanted to conclude the book with some documents that indicate the rise of the movement against the global war on terror, but not attempt to try to be exhaustive in our treatment of that moment. And so we sort of thought of 2001 as an important moment of change, right, in inaugurating a new era of radical organizing, but also one that, really indicates some of the longevities of many different movements that we track over this period.
Great, thanks, Emily. Dan, in the book's acknowledgement, you both mentioned that the project was first solicited a decade ago. And what convinced you to undertake this extraordinary task of compiling documents and these particular documents? And how did you even start identifying sources for an anthology of this scope and depth? I imagine that mainstream sources like university libraries were just a part of the picture.
Yeah, well, I would say, I think for both of us, certainly speaking for myself, did not anticipate this to be a 10-year project when we when we began on it. But I also am really grateful for the time it took, because I think it gave us a chance to, and it's not like we were working on this like all day, every day for 10 years. Emily and I both wrote other books during that time. We both moved to different parts of the country, and lots of things happened in that time period. But I think there was something really wonderful to be able to think together about about history in that time and to think together about the history of struggles over that period of time. And so obviously there's been a lot of new writing and not just scholarly writing, but new writing generally about that time period that we could sort of digest and think about, but also the different kind of peaks and valleys of struggle, right? I mean, I think we began this around the Occupy Wall Street movement and around that sort of general time period, and Idle No More, and it comes out after a summer of sustained rebellion against police. Against police and sort of larger Black Lives Matter movement, larger struggles around the pandemic. And so I think engaging with those struggles and thinking through those struggles also help us think about the past, right? And so this is why we talk a lot about the idea of usable pasts, and something that I think is really profound in the course of struggle, right? And to the second part of your question about how we did this, certainly university libraries were one key resource. And because Emily and I have written about other social movements, we had a lay of the landscape for some of the kind of archival collections. But we really drew a lot on independent archives and movement archives, like your neighbor, CPE's neighbor at the Freedom Archives in San Francisco, and several other kind of independent movement archives around the country. And again, it wasn't just a process of sort of dialogue and reflection between the two of us, but really reaching out to a number of movement veterans to try and think through these things. So there were some people who, we would ask, like, what's a good document about X, right? And sort of using that as a chance to really fill in our own knowledge. I mean, just to give one example, we worked a lot, I think, to really reflect the tactical diversity, the political diversity, but also kind of geographical diversity. And so, we really spent time trying to pursue, like, what are some good struggles from, like, the Intermountain West, right? What are some good struggles about the kind of agricultural area, agricultural struggles and rural struggles in this time period, which is not an area of familiarity for either of us beforehand, but that led us into some really good kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and I want to get to the organization and structure, but maybe I'll ask this of both of you, because it must have been fun to connect with organizers and some of these more independent archives. We talked about talking to Claude at Freedom Archives. I'm wondering if in the process, if there was anything that was on the cutting room floor that kind of you either heard strong arguments to include, or that you both wrestled with, or each of you individually sort of felt like, I really wish that we had been able to include this particular piece.
There was a lot that was left on the cutting room floor when we initially were compiling. I think we cut like a third of what we had. It's already a pretty big book with a lot of material. So when we were cutting, we were kind of trying to hone in on documents that stood pretty well on their own, like didn't require a lot of exposition, and that primarily were kind of about action and tactics and theory on the ground, but not primarily kind of analyses of past movements or mistakes or kind of highly theoretical pieces. And one of the strategies we also used was to approach a number of current writers, scholars, independent writers, and activists to write snapshot essays, which are these short pieces throughout the book. There's about 30 of them throughout the book that are very short essays that describe particular campaigns or events or tactics. And we turned to the snapshot essays to represent things that were difficult to kind of reflect in a document, right? Like a whole campaign that was hard to encapsulate with one piece. And we also wound up relying a fair amount on kind of coverage, movement journalism, to describe particular kinds of campaigns. Other pieces that I'll let Dan talk about, maybe a couple pieces that were favorites that we wound up having to cut, but we did occasionally also have some issues with For the most part, we were able to get things at very low or no cost in terms of reproduction, but there were a few pieces that we couldn't include because of reproduction fees.
Yeah, and that we would have for sure.
Yes.
I think one thing that was interesting in putting it together is that, you know, trying to identify some documents that were really influential to the movement, that still stand the test of time, and that tell us something, right? And so there are some examples like the Combahee River Collective Statement, sort of most famously, but even, you know, something like Vito Russo's speech "Why We Fight" from ACT UP. You know, there are these pieces that really are almost like load-bearing pieces, right? Sort of, in a bunch of different ways. There are some pieces that that we had maybe initially included in that earlier version that Emily spoke of, that was, you know, at least a third longer than this, and the book already is about a third longer than it was supposed to be. That when we were sort of thinking about cutting, you know, its influence was one category, but another category is like, what does it reveal, right? And so like one of my favorite things that I, you know, knew existed but didn't really know anything about before working on this book was the international Black Hills International Survival Gathering in 1980, right, which brought over 10,000 people to South Dakota, right? And it was this really, I think, phenomenal and fantastic gathering, sort of spearheaded by Indigenous groups, but also a kind of critical meeting point for environmentalists and anti-nuclear activists who are not Indigenous, meeting with Indigenous nations and peoples from throughout the Americas. And, you know, there's a very famous speech that Russell Means of the American Indian Movement gives that's a critique of Marxism at that speech that I think has been very influential. John Trudell, also the American Indian Movement, gave a speech at that same gathering that I think has been far less influential. But but we only had space to include one of them. And you know, we thought that the Trudell piece was actually more helpful, right? Not that there's, you know, I mean, I think Means' piece is worth engaging with. There's a lot there, but in terms of what we were trying to do with the book in identifying, you know, particularly for that piece, a kind of Indigenous cosmology that was also about an organizing orientation, and that was also that we could do relatively quickly, right? Right, because both speeches are quite long. The Trudell piece actually stands out more than the Means piece, right? And so I think there's a way that I hope what we've done here is not only, you know, mine archives, but also curate an archive, right? And I think in that act of curation, hopefully it allows an opportunity to, you know, revisit some old pieces, but also to encounter some pieces that might be new to people, and to see, in fact, their ongoing inspiration or influence.
Yeah, it's what's lovely. I you know, obviously I haven't gone through the whole volume, but was able to look through the entire table of contents, and it's kind of it's almost like a mixtape from a friend who knows like movements, right? It's just like all of these like really it's curated in this way where, like you said, it's not fully comprehensive, as nothing can be, but it does tell a story. And I was really taken, you know, by seeing some of those groupings and seeing organizations in relation to each other in the different sections, like, you know, the Combahee piece from 1977, and then in that same section, critical resistance and Insight Women of Color Against Violence, talking about gender violence and the prison industrial complex in 2001, for example. And I was wondering if there were any pairs or sets of documents that provided you with particular noteworthy juxtapositions within any of those sections that like illustrated like changes or evolutions in radicalisms, or, you know, on the other hand, like constants in political approaches that stood the test of time. And that can go to Emily and Dan.
While Emily thinks, can I just say, hearing it described as a mixtape from someone who knows movements is like maybe the highest compliment that I think the book could receive.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways, I think, to, I mean, one of the ways that I hope that the book will be used is that people will think creatively about the kinds of connections that they might draw, and really kind of add in, new ideas and new ways of thinking about connections between movements that, maybe didn't occur to me or to Dan, and that really reflect, contemporary struggles or contemporary questions. Definitely, there are a number of kinds of things, pairs we might look at within particular sections, but also across them, right? So for example, like within, just in the very first section that's on kind of these flashpoints, we call it feminist and queer flashpoints. I really love the sort of pairing, in the sort of midst of the 1970s between the two pieces that are coverage, kind of movement coverage of the Inez Garcia trial and defense campaign, which was, a collective participatory defense campaign for a woman who'd been accused of murder committed in self-defense against her rapist, with then just 2 years later, this open letter to the anti-rape movement from members of Santa Cruz Women Against Rape, critiquing the turn to carceral feminism. So it's these like two examples of sources for anti-carceral feminism in that moment, right? One from a defense campaign and another from, the sort of the experience of negotiating within an organization about how to relate to the police and to the criminal legal system. But then there's also, those are pieces that are really close to each other in the book. But then there are also pairings that I think really work, widely across the book, right? Like thinking, for example, about lots of different pieces that are thinking about these questions, sort of building on the Santa Cruz rape statement, Women Against Rape statement, of the issue of kind of who are our bedfellows, right? Or what are the coalitions we're building or failing to build, right? So there's a piece critiquing critiquing kind of the, the context of the sex wars. So it's an anti-porn feminist discussion, but it can be read in really interesting ways alongside Joseph Gerson's piece about the inattention to Palestine from within the anti-nuclear movement, right? To Israel and Palestine from within the anti-nuclear movement. And they're like completely, you would think of they're hundreds of pages apart in the book, because one is in this section on fighting the right and the other is in this section, broadly the section on anti-militarist and anti-imperialist movements. But they both are looking at this question of, what are the alliances and what is being neglected, right? And so that's something that comes out to me as a theme. There's many other kinds of pairings we could think about.
Yeah, I would just add, early on in thinking about the project, we decided that we wanted to organize it thematically rather than chronologically, because there were these different kinds of crescendos across time, right? And that in fact, even though we experience history in a linear way, it doesn't actually move in that sort of linear way. And so when we're thinking across movements, it seemed more valuable to do that thematically. And so as we did that, we saw, pretty much every issue or struggle within this time period had a kind of armed struggle component, as it did various kinds of pacifist and nonviolent components. And so I think there are these different kinds of pairings that I hope people see throughout the book by, communiques around, US colonization of Puerto Rico, to support for apartheid, to support for death squads in Central America, right? And that to sort of abolitionists and anti-prison and anti-policing kind of campaigns, right? So to see this kind of armed component to all of them, right, I think works already at that kind of comparative point, right? That there's not like a phase of the movement that we could say, chapter 2 is the armed phase or something like that, but that was a kind of part of the tactical repertoire of the time period. I also think questions of, there's some really interesting and valuable pairings thinking through land, right? So there's a section about, or subsection of one of the chapters about Fight for the City, Free the Land, that looks at sort of anti-gentrification struggles and rural struggles that, and we can see things like Cop Watch show up there as a kind of anti-gentrification movement, just as it shows up in some of the like anti-policing fights as about stopping police brutality. But then questions of land also come up again towards the end of the book in sort of bringing together some indigenous and sort of revolutionary Black nationalist and abolitionist voices and thinking about interdependence and land as a kind of basis for building interdependent movements.
So on that point about the structure, can you talk a little bit about what the specific organization and structure is, these 4 sections, and what the logic and rationale behind that is, and what it is intended to communicate to the reader?
Yeah, sure. So there's 4 main sections of the book, or parts, part 1, 2, 3, 4, that each have 3 subsections. And those main parts are really kind of organized around sites or scales of struggle. So the first one is called Bodies and Lives. The second one is Walls and Gates. The third is Borders and Maps. And the last is Utopias and Dystopias, right? And so those each speak to, locations, key questions, but that are kind of organized geographically, not in the sense of particular locations within the United States, but kind of geographic scales of struggle, right? And in some ways, of course, there are kind of, movement clusters within those, right? So Bodies and Lives has, the bulk of the specifically feminist and queer material, but then there are also feminist and queer interventions really across the book. And we did that very purposefully to avoid a kind of identitarian organization of the book. And similarly, Walls and Gates is the primary section that is dealing with prisons, the PIC, abolitionist voices, and also questions of gentrification, housing. The last subsection within it is called Fight for the City, Free the Land, right? But there are also kind of some questions of carcerality, abolitionist politics across the book, as I mentioned, kind of in the very first section. These perspectives on kind of some really great early sources in anti-carceral feminism, for example. And so, on and on throughout the book, right? But we really wanted to avoid, as I said, a kind of identitarian framing that would say, okay, here's all the like Black radical material, and here's the sort of here's the feminist stuff, and here's the environmental, as if there is not, the important thing I really think about this period is the interweaving, right? That there's a kind of dominant notion that this is a sort of kind of tired old narrative about the long 1960s, right? Is that there's a proliferation of movements in the late 1960s, early 1970s, but this proliferation destroys the idea of a unified movement and really is just everybody kind of retreating into navel gazing and kind of identitarian, the worst version of identity politics, right? Not really what Combahee was saying in coining the concept of identity politics, but the worst kind of internalized, internal gaze. But we really don't see the period in that way, right? For me, the proliferation of many different kinds of movements and tactics and strategies that emerges after the late 1960s is strength. That is the strength of grassroots radicalism from that era forward. So thinking about kind of interconnections and the multiplicity of kinds of responses, but still attending to the ways that struggles might kind of be grouped out by their kind of the scales of their targets or the scales of the vision that they have, for me is a useful way to both, show that an identitarian organization doesn't make any sense, and also help us to think productively about connections that might not have been apparent or obvious, because of the ways, people have to organize locally, they organize within the folks among the folks they know, and so on.
So, who was the intended audience for Remaking Radicalism? You know, when you were, and I guess like how do you want them to put the anthology to use and or engage in the material? I think, as you said, Dan, before, like as a usable pass in complex service of the present, as it was written in the book. Who is that audience, and how do you want them to use this material?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is not a book that we necessarily imagine people reading from cover to cover, although if people do that, great. I mean, cover to cover in order, right? Hopefully people will have a chance to read it cover to cover. But I think the idea, right, is that these kind of thematic organizations that Emily just spoke of really give an opportunity to dive deep into certain themes, but also to read broadly and to read across the sort of movements in that time period. And so, it hopefully doesn't sound too pat to say that, our intended audience is people that care about struggle, right? Which, that it would be organizers and activists and people sort of coming into their own, whether that's in the classroom context or in a study group context, and that it's hopefully, the mix of documents, the mix of time periods and geographies and strategies is one that I think we hope could be useful to people at different stages of their development and different stages of their journey, right? So there are people who have written things in this book who are still very much alive and very much active, who might get something out of this, right, by seeing what other corners of the movement were up to. I think it was really, the small example, right, but to like do the section on some of the anti-prison organizing, and I feel that that's a movement that I very much come out of and have been mentored by. But finding some of the documents on abolition from some more like wider, more faith-based sectors of the movement in the 70s, which was like not my sector, right, that I came out of, right? It was not like the sector that was like, that I have been organizing with, but are a really important part of that history of abolition, right? And so I think even, it certainly did that for me in terms of being a kind of expanding my own consciousness. So I hope that can be that for other people, right? And I think reading it in some kind of structured context, a study group or a class or something, just having a reading buddy, I think is what I think the book is really best made for, right? Because these documents are really rich and like will hopefully be a good conversation starter, right? Both like, oh, like, did you know that happened, right? But also like, oh, how did these debates over, structure that people were having 40 years ago help us think about structure in our own context, right? And when I see people like now debating like, oh, is defund the police the best way to name the slow, right? Like as if these debates are just happening now for the first time. I hope that this book can be a useful kind of antidote to be like, oh yeah, like there's no new, strategy or slogan or approach. Like the question is like, what best speaks to our moment, right? And I think that's really, for me, like what the usable past idea speaks to.
Emily, you have anything to add in terms of audience for the book?
I mean, certainly, we know people who are assigning it in traditional classrooms, right? Which is really exciting. And I hope that those will be classroom discussions that really, help students think about also kind of about the same kind of conversations they might have in activist reading groups, right? Or that maybe even inspire them to bring the book into conversations with their friends or into conversations with activist groups that they're in on campus or off, right? So I hope that the classroom use can be a kind of portal for students into, movement, really kind of very overtly movement uses of the book. And that, the sort of questions that might get raised in a classroom setting about, for example, kind of historical narrative about the 1970s, 80s, 90s, or about particular kind of strands of movements, that those questions also might be relevant, to helping people think about contemporary questions and struggles, right? Because I think that that issue of, both Dan and I are professors, and so I know I hear all the time, and I'm sure Dan hears all the time, kind of like, I didn't know this had happened, and it's a great kind of reaction, because it's usually voiced with a kind of frustration or rage over silences that are committed, right, around the past. But it is also for me, of course, part of the point is, well, yeah, I know you haven't heard about this. That's why I'm trying to teach it to you, right? And why I think that the process of exploration and research can be so exciting. So I hope too that that both in places like CPE conversations and radical study groups, and in kind of traditional classroom settings, that people will take a particular source and then think, well, what else might I connect this to, or find other kinds of examples, either past or present, that they would connect to, whether that's through archival research or through kind of comparing a piece to something that might be somewhat better known, or a piece that might reveal kind of left influence on kind of somewhat more recognized liberal agendas, right, or conflict with, right? So I'm excited to sort of imagine all the kinds of uses that we haven't really thought about. I'll say too that I think one of the reasons that I loved your comment that it's kind of like a mixtape is I actually would love to see people create actual mixtapes in about the book, right?
I was just thinking that.
To kind of help think through the book, or help think through a particular kind of reading of the book. So that I think would be another really fun, as well as, I suppose the last would be like additional visuals, right? We have a number of reproductions of mostly political posters and other kinds of art throughout the text, but nowhere near as many as we might have included with a kind of unlimited press budget or something like that. So I hope that folks will get excited about other kinds of representation beyond the primarily written texts we have. And the last thing I'll say is in other languages, right? We made a decision, like we were going to have materials written in English, but of course there are a lot of other sources that inherently cut out.
Yeah,
I would just sort of triple down on the mixtape comment, like because the as we were talking through the project and the limitations of space, like and we say this in the introduction, like we couldn't. There's a lot about the ways that culture, different forms of youth culture, are really important, gateway mobilizations, and in some cases not only gateway, but mobilizations for people. And it was just hard to represent that because it's a lot more kind of ethereal and experiential than it is textual. And so Emily and I had sort of talked about like, could we do like, here's our mixtape of things that we were listening to while putting it together, like, or like what Emily was just saying about, like, kind of mixtape assignment as a kind of prompt from the book, right? Might be really valuable.
Yeah, I'm glad that comment has triggered this response. I think part of it was also I had listened to this conversation with a Jamaican poet, Linton Kwesi Johnson, who was talking about the changes in baseline rhythms during different political periods in Jamaican like dub music, and I was really it just got me thinking. I'm like, wow, I haven't really thought about how that might track with where movements are in different periods, and so it'd be interesting to have people do versions of that with your anthology. I want to end kind of with a maybe an easier question, which is what are your respective favorite parts of the book, or which part of the book do you think is particularly useful for organizers and activists in the current moment?
That's the hardest question you've asked.
Yeah, that's like choosing your favorite kid or your favorite, pet over time or what have you. Dan, do you want to dive in, or
I'm flummoxed and stumped. I mean, I will say, like, I think that the way that it's structured, like, I think for people coming from certain kinds of political work, like people doing anti-fascist organizing, I think would, be really, drawn to the section of the book that's on fighting the right. People doing different kinds of prisoner solidarity work would be drawn to the fighting the prison state section and so on. So I think there's something there that speaks to the kinds of campaigns and struggles that people are doing currently. I think what I'm most excited or most hopeful about people's use of the book is to read across those sections, right? So that anti-fascists are reading about, feminist and queer flashpoints, and are reading about, direct action guides for stopping the end of the world, right? That there are these sort of tactical and strategic, and as well as kind of theoretical and conceptual orientations throughout that I hope can expand the horizons of contemporary organizers. But that's not sort of one section of the book. That's more how I hope people will kind of dip into it.
Mm-hmm.
That was a clever way to cheat on the question, Dan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think, to a degree, my favorites shift day to day a little bit depending on what I'm seeking or what I am wanting, right? So there are, as Dan mentioned, there are a few pieces that I think are, I mean, they're beautiful rhetorically, right? Or they are, they have been really influential as speeches, right? And I love those pieces because I can, in some cases, I have actually heard the recordings or seen the recordings, right? Like Dan mentions Vito Russo's Why We Fight. I teach it every chance I get, and so there are a number of other pieces like that I think are, I would say also like Mab Seagrass, A Bridge Not a Wedge, and Leonard Peltier's statement in the book. There are a number that are just, they are beautiful to read. They're beautiful to read out loud. And I found them really powerful in that way. But then there are other days that I'm really drawn to pieces that that really kind of, I think, shine in showing concrete application and in showing kind of the ways that collectives of people, struggled with a particular context, right? Like, I'm really glad we were able to include some of the write-ups of the Laotian Organizing Project, right, as part of the Stopping the End of the World section, among a cluster of other documents about environmental justice and really kind of the growth of the framework of environmental justice. And it's, it's the kind of, it's actually a statement that comes from really a program report, right? So it's an interesting document to me because I think I've read many a program report, right? And they're not always kind of like inspiring, but I keep coming back to the Laotian Organizing Project because I really love the way that it shows the strength of that particular organization, right? Which was, an organization of Laotian and other Southeast Asian, mostly young people fighting toxics in Richmond, right, in North Bay of Bay Area, California. And it's, it's positioned alongside like statements from Dave Foreman and Judy Bari and the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership, Summit. And so I think it just paints this like rich portrait of the breadth of environmental work in the early 1990s. So it like I said, it kind of depends on what I'm looking for. And I think, also if I'm thinking about it in the sense of a curriculum, a syllabus, I might start with those pieces that are really kind of grab you at the heart, right? Because of their rhetorical power. And then over time get into the sort of nitty gritty nuts and bolts because you've, pulled people into kind of thinking through the why, and then you get them into the how.
If I can add a more specific answer than my first one, but also something that we haven't spoken about as much that I think is a really important piece of the book, which is the internationalism, and I think it's something that is not as visibly prominent in some sectors of the left today, as it, I think, was in the period covered by the book. But it's, you know, it's one quarter of the documents in the book come from different kinds of internationalist campaigns, and I think a couple of things that I would want to highlight there. One is the snapshot essay by Chris Dixon about the road to Seattle, right? Which is one that we asked him to write because there are all kinds of documents about the significance of the protests in 1999 against the World Trade Organization. But so many of those documents really see Seattle as a kind of starting point. And to what Chris does in that snapshot, and what I think, you know, broadly what some of the, like, you know, African Liberation Day Coalition to Justice for Janitors, like some of the other documents do more implicitly, is to show how these different battles against, you know, neoliberalism, these different battles against, again, sort of anti-immigration sort of politics more broadly, allowed for something like the protests in 1999 to happen. Right, and I think, you know, we spoke earlier about 2001 and the sort of launch of the War on Terror. I think there's also a lot in the book that shows, you know, the launch of the global War on Terror is the culmination of lots of little sort of micro anti-terror wars that the U.S. had been engaged with against revolutionaries within the U.S. as well as around the world. But I also think that there's the last part of that section on Borders and Maps is called "Not in Our Name." And we got a series of documents that really work through that concept, right? Of, you know, support for U.S. support for Israel shouldn't be done in our name, and we have that, you know, things from New Jewish Agenda and from Women in Black. But also, you know, we see that kind of slogan resonate, you know, with groups like Roots Against War, coming and the sort of documents against the first U.S. war in Iraq in 1991, and of course coming out again much more strongly after 2001 and in response to the War on Terror. And so we can see some of these same kind of conceptual frameworks guide a kind of anti-imperialist solidarity across, you know, a 3-decade period.
Emily and Dan, where can people access the book?
Well, one place you can learn more about it is we created a website, remakingradicalism.org, which provides the introduction and the table of contents, so you can get a little bit of a better sense of what's included. Also has a link called Beyond the Book that includes links to a lot of the archives that we used, if you're interested in research, and some of the blurbs and praise we've been getting. And of course, you know, buy it at your local independent bookstore or through Bookshop would be the site I would recommend if you want to buy it independently, but online. And then there's also a press page from University of Georgia Press as well.
And every once in a while they do sales, University of Georgia, and so whenever we get a coupon code, we will put it up on that website, remakingradicalism.org.
That's much appreciated. Emily and Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure. I thank you so much for joining us at CPE Study Hall, and congratulations on publishing this incredible anthology. And I imagine it will have lasting use for organizers and students of movements for years to come. I'm looking for the mixtapes to come out, and I say that in the plural. I hope that there's volume 1 and volume 2. I think each of those subsections there could be 4 of them. And we appreciate your contributions to social movements here at CPE. And I'd say that CPE is particularly excited about this book because it's very much in line with our mission to ground movements in historical knowledge. And I know personally that I'm excited to purchase my own copy and have it as a durable reference on my bookshelf, because I think it will be just that when things come to mind. And I think that's a great addition to any leftist book collection. So to everyone that's been watching and listening, we recommend that you check out Remaking Radicalism. Talk about it with your friends and comrades and put it to good use. And thank you again for joining us on CPE Study Hall. And thank you, Emily and Dan, once more.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.